And joining me now is Sam Bankman-Fried. He's the CEO of the cryptocurrency exchange FTX. You may have seen their TV ads occasionally, and one of America's youngest billionaires. And recently, he's used that money to become one of the biggest donors in this year's midterm elections. Sam, nice to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Of course.
So let me start. You're the fourth, you may not know this, but you know it now. You're the fourth largest individual donor, essentially, to the midterms for this cycle. You are on a list that includes George Soros, Ken Griffin, Richard Uihlein, Peter Thiel, just below you. Why did you decide it was politics and not something more charitable to spend your money on?
It's a good question. And, to be clear, we have also given, I think, upwards of $100 million this year to
I'm not saying you're not charitable,
but
you've chosen to engage politically.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that what it really goes down to is two things. And the first is that policy really matters, right? I think COVID is one of the clearest examples of this, where we did not, as a country or as a world, frankly, have a coherent response to COVID. And we missed in both directions. Mm-hmm. It was careening wildly around, and we still haven't learned the lesson. Like, it's not like if a new pandemic came today that we would be ready to deal with it. That's kind of a travesty, because there probably will be another pandemic. And this has got to be a thing that government is involved in, that government is working proactively on. It's an one example of an incredibly important thing that society has to do. And, this is something that DC is going to have to play a big role in one way or another. And I think that, doing what we can to support, good policy there is one of the higher leverage things. And then at the same point, and somewhat relatedly, I think just having a constructive atmosphere in DC is incredibly important.
So first, though, if the pandemic was your number one issue, you could have easily gone the Gates route. Right? The Gates Foundation, and he decided that's the area, and he's been working on this for a decade.
And it's been amazing, some of the things he's done.
Why did you think the political space would be even open to this conversation?
Well, it's a good question. And we have also been looking at whether there are, public health charities that we can be giving to help support work directly. And we have done some exploratory things there. We may ramp up, especially if there's sort of good results there. But yeah, why did it seem like this was another avenue that might be tractable? The first is, I'm really excited about what the Gates Foundation and what some other large, players have done to try and prepare. Some of what that means is trying to identify the opportunities that there are fewer people in, the opportunities and needs that the country has where there just aren't as many people on top of it right now. And so some of this is looking where other people haven't looked. Because that means that there are things that are underdone there. That's one piece of this. And I think the other piece of this is that when it comes to, pandemic response, both public and private have to be involved, right? And you can look at vaccine production has to have private companies involved in it, but you look at both the policy that, the federal and state governments are going to have, and a lot of the funding for this research is coming from government as well.
You've spent your money a little bit differently in politics than others have. Didn't go well in Oregon. What did you learn, and how are you adapting? Because you strike me as somebody, you try something, you look at how it works. Okay, let me try this way.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, part of this is, look, stuff happens. I do what I can do what I think is right and adapt. And, in Oregon, there's a candidate who I thought had a chance of being, one of the biggest advocates for pandemic prevention, in D.C. And that's really what's needed is there are people going around arguing against preventing for pandemics. What's needed is champions who will really push things forward. So I'm very excited about that. I think one of the things I learned is, look, there's really diminishing marginal returns here, right? There's no matter how much you spend in any one place, there's just a limit to how much impact it's going to have. There's a limit to how much support it can be. And I think that was the biggest takeaway from it was just, Do you
think you spent too much money there in hindsight?
Yeah, I think it's probably right.
And when you say, so there's a point of saturation that you've learned?
Yeah, that's right.
What about your individual influence? You've seen what's happened to George Soros.
Yep.
He's been politically attacked. It gets it up. You can make the same case for the Adelson family, both Sheldon and Miriam, right?
Yep.
These are two people that have been dominant over the last decade.
Yep.
Are you prepared for that?
So, in the end, I want to do what's right for the country and, not optimize for people saying nice things about me. If people say mean things about me, I can take it. But the other thing that I would say is I'm really aiming to do this in a bipartisan way. And I think that's something...
You've given to some Republicans, but it's been very targeted.
It's been targeted, and I think the reason for that is that I don't, at its core, view this as a Democrats versus Republicans thing where my core goal is boosting a party. I view this as having constructive people, whatever party they're part of, is incredibly valuable for DC. And it's something I've just seen on the ground where people who are willing to get together and try and do the important things for the country, they can compromise their party, and they're who save the day at the end. And so I'm happy to support, across the aisle in either direction. And as you said, it is super targeted because a lot of this is thinking hard about exactly who are the people who are just, really exemplary public servants.
So there are going to be some people who watch this and say, Rich guy's got his own agenda here. He's not telling us. Why shouldn't folks be a little bit skeptical of your real motives here, Mitt? That this is really all about crypto. This is really all about your business, which is regulating what you do.
Right. It's a good question. And frankly, everyone should always be skeptical of things like this, right? I'm not going to tell people that they should give anyone a free pass on it. And I think what I'd say is, look at the evidence, try and trace out what's happening. It's really funny. Sometimes I'll read these articles and they'll say, SBF donates to candidate something crypto, something, and the entire article will be like, we're trying really hard to find the crypto angle, and we haven't found it yet. The candidates have no statements. They don't know what a Bitcoin is. There's a crypto angle. We're still looking. And it's like, no, that was...
People aren't taking you at your word?
People aren't taking me at my word, and I understand that. And I think what I'd say is then do the research. Look at the policies that I'm supporting, the candidates that I'm supporting, and many of these people, I have no idea what their position is on crypto.
Okay, but you now will have lawmakers return your calls a lot easier than the average person, right? So your money is effective in that respect, and you are going to be able to make your case in front of members of Congress because you're willing to spend money. Have you thought about that?
I think it's probably true. And frankly, I think that there is value from the pandemic prevention side there, being able to, again, get in front of them and say, hey, look, this is a big issue. I think that, on the crypto side, the way that I view that is as I have a duty as a member of the industry to try and get us regulated, to try and move the industry in a more responsible direction. And I think that requires engagement. I think it'd be irresponsible of me not to engage, with Capitol Hill, with regulators. And the things that I've been arguing for are more regulation for the industry. I think that's what's right for the country. I don't know if that's what's right for a company, but it's what needs to happen.
Let me ask you this. Should it be so easy for you to become a big donor in our political system? Do you think your money should be as relevant in our system as it can become?
It's a good question. And it's so hard to view this outside of the lens of what is going on right now, of what different equilibrium
These are the rules that are. And you're sitting there and you're
right.
like, hey, if this is how it works, then I'm going to participate. I guess I'm asking you,
what
do you think
should
it
the rules
should
be?
Yeah.
I have a lot of sympathy for thoughts of overhauling things in one direction or another. I've thought about this. I don't feel confident that I know what the right answer is, right? You could imagine a highly transparent regime where the emphasis was on full transparency of contributions. You could imagine a capped regime like what we had, at least in larger part before Citizens United. There are arguments for that. I frankly don't feel like I feel confident what the right answer is there. I certainly don't feel like we've necessarily reached it as a society, though.
Well, you think every money you spend in politics should be disclosed publicly? Are you comfortable with that?
I think that I think what I would say is, if there was a norm where every dollar that everyone donated in politics was to be disclosed publicly, I would have a lot of sympathy for that. I think I might support it. I haven't thought carefully about it enough to know. But
well, it sounds like what you're saying is maybe there's some donations that you have made that you wouldn't make if you knew they were going to be immediately public.
So I think I don't generally think about it that way. I generally think of it as like these are the right the right contributions to make. I think that and I think that there is a thing where it's important what the norms are because that's what press is going to judge everything by, right? And it's important that there is the right context. And I think that you would see fairly different treatment of things if everything was made transparent. I think that there would be advantages to that system.
You made your money in some ways by finding a loophole, right? And in the exchange rates and how the exchange system, and you saw something was missing. I'm curious now, bringing a fresh set of eyes to how campaign politics works, to how the funding mechanisms work. Have you found this sort of gaping hole, flaw, or loophole that you're like, how come nobody else has noticed this?
So to the extent that I have, I think what it is people are just not engaged enough in policy. They're not engaged enough in what's going on in D.C.
When you say people meaning the electorate or people meaning elected officials?
Oh, I mean the electorate.
Okay.
And I think that there's sort of this notion that I certainly ascribed to at one point that I think a lot of people do, that you can't actually have, your vote doesn't actually matter, that this is all sort of irrelevant. And I think that just turns out to not be right. And even if you just look at voting, right, like, is it worth it to vote? The answer is yes, right? Does your vote matter for elections? The answer is yes. And if you do the math, it's actually extremely impactful. Every person's vote. I mean, obviously, if it's a presidential election, it matters if you're in a swing state. But, you know, you're having impact over millions of dollars in expectation of what happens. And so I think that, you know, the sort of notion that has sort of flooded the press at various points about, like, this is an impossible system to interface with, I think actually everyone has important interfacing with it.
You have talked that $1 billion is perhaps your ceiling for 2024. How would you imagine spending that? Candidates or your own organization to maybe educate the public?
So it all is going to depend on the details. And I really do mean that in that, like,
depend on who's running? Does it depend on if it's Biden and Trump type of thing? That's
one thing it's going to depend on. And it's not just the presidency as well. It's more generally like, I want to support great public servants. And, you know, if you imagine an election where everyone running on both sides of the aisle for every race was an amazing public servant, I say, great. You know, I'm not needed here. Like, this is, you know, I'm happy. And, you know, I think that if you had the opposite where everyone was horrific, which obviously won't happen, I think then what I would start to get to is there needs to be an informational campaign to alert people to how poorly people are being nominated here, right? And so it's going to be really, really responsive to the weeds of which direction things go.
Let me get you out of here on this, because you obviously have a different kind of eye when you're looking for a public servant.
Yep.
Who impresses you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, you know, I've been impressed actually by more people than I thought I would be. I was pretty skeptical.
You assumed the system was a bunch of idiots.
That's exactly right.
You came in here. You're not alone in thinking that when you come in.
Yep.
So the more time you've spent, so give me a couple on each side of the aisle.
I mean, I think that, like, you know, looking at a few things that I've been working on, right, like on just the crypto regulation side, like looking at the progress that, like, the Senate Agricultural Committee has made, working across the aisle to get regulatory oversight for the industry. It's been really inspiring just to see the hard work put in there and the, you know, the sort of like attention on customer protection, on federal oversight. And sort of grokking, like, it's important that this happens and that this happens quickly, because, you know, every day that goes by without oversight, there's just more risk for customers. There's more risk in the industry. And, you know, the notion of, like, just, you know, kind of getting up and doing it has been great. And, you know, that's been, you know, obviously Stabenow, Bozeman, Booker, Thune, who have been working on that. You have the, you know, Gelber and Lummis bill, you know, Thompson, Conan, and the House. Like, it's been very bipartisan and just, like, very constructive, which has been, you know, great.
You're in a space that's bipartisan right now. I mean, that's probably helpful. You're having an experience that other people are not having.
I think that's right. And I think that when I get less hopeful, it's when I see people talking about politically charged topics and just the norms of discourse crash.
Sam Bankman-Fried, appreciate you coming on. Not every major donor will talk about why they do it. I appreciate that you did.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.